directs the sequel, Pumpkinhead 2, Bloodwings. And this one stars Andrew Robinson. It's also notable for a few cameo appearances, including Leanna Quigley and Kane Hodder. So this is a 1993 follow-up from the original, which was directed by Stan Winston. This one had about a quarter of the budget of the original, and as such, definitely looks like a cheaper film. It's also really unconnected to the first movie, and it's just another story about a kind of rural area that has this kind of Pumpkinhead legend, but doesn't have characters or any real connection to the original. So this movie starts off with a prologue in the 1950s showing a group of 6 teenage boys ultimately torture and murder this orphan who kind of lives in the woods, who has kind of a facial deformity, in a very kind of cruel manner. And he's looked after by this old woman. And cut to, I guess, the early 90s, modern times in this context, and we have a sheriff played by Andrew Robertson, who has once lived in this town when he was a boy, but now been living and working in New York, moved back to this small rural town with his teenage daughter and his wife, because the teenage daughter's got in trouble. Anyway, she immediately falls in with a bad crowd, this kind of group of rebellious teens, and they set about causing more trouble and ultimately end up responsible for the death of this old woman, who happens to be the woman that was looking after this orphan in the woods in the 50s. And she ultimately is a kind of a witch, although a different witch from the original movie. And because of this, the Pumpkinhead demon returns on a mission of revenge. Not just to revenge this old woman, but also to revenge his own death when he was a human, for those teenage boys who are now all adults. So he's after 2 generations of killers, basically. And it's up to Andrew Robertson's sheriff to figure out what's going on and put a stop to it. What will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's talk about it. So again, quarter of the budget of the original. It does show. This definitely looks like a lower budget movie than the first. What does work in the movie's favour? So you do see a lot more of the Pumpkinhead creature in this one. I do think that's a double-edged sword. But if you want to have a greater look at this creature, you want to have it with more screen time, best sort of a closer look in regards to its design, you'll get more of that in this film. It has a lot more screen time than the original. It's a higher body count than the original, so you feel this creature really is going on a complete sort of causing mayhem, because it's really after 2 generations worth of killers here. So you get a lot more carnage for your buck here, I suppose. There is an attempt here to have a sympathetic edge to the Pumpkinhead creature, because if you know the mythology here, it's ultimately spawned from a corpse of someone who's been wronged or something like that, and it gives the kind of the creature a sort of Frankenstein's monster-esque kind of vibe to it, where it really was quite cruelly murdered when it was a boy, and you can totally understand why it wants revenge. And it does have a couple of scenes where I do feel has some genuine kind of emotional resonance. It's a little bit hammy and strong, I think, on those scenes. But, I'll say there's a few scenes here where we think, damn those teenagers! Teenagers, they're the rule of society. There's definitely those kind of scenes there. I think Andrew Robertson actually does a pretty good job here as our sort of sheriff. And he takes this role pretty seriously. And he does bring some sort of gravitas to it. There's 1 or 2 other kind of performances where I think were okay, from an otherwise mixed bunch, which we'll come on to. So there is that. And there's an attempt here to kind of expand out the mythology a little bit about the Pumpkinhead creature and the circumstances. I mean, it feels like it sort of contradicts the original to a degree. But ultimately, you could say, okay, there's multiple reasons how and why you can kind of get this Pumpkinhead creature to do things and things like that, and what it actually means. Or maybe there's different rules for different Pumpkinhead creatures. Who knows? But you know, ultimately, yeah, it's a different set of circumstances, although there are some kind of similarities to it. You know, overall, I do think it's a little bit of a mindless film, to be honest, but it has a certain degree of fun. Just having this kind of creature actually just going on a rampage and kind of cutting through people, and this time sort of trying to communicate a little bit with these kind of markings that it's sort of doing. So you do feel it's, again, has a little bit more almost humanity to a degree. So let's talk about what doesn't work in this film. As I've mentioned, this movie is considerably lower budget than the original, and that does show. So I've mentioned that you see more of the Pumpkinhead creature. That might be a good thing. But it does mean you see the flaws more, because this being a lower budget movie, the creature does not look as good. When it's kind of moving around, the creature looks way rubbery. I mean, it's got this big bulbous head that's kind of literally, in some scenes, kind of flopping around, like the silicon mass that it is, and it just sort of flopping around. It looks like a kind of an octopus on land, if you know what I mean. And then it's like its arms and things like that just don't seem particularly kind of well articulated, and it very much looks like a puppet rather than the kind of the more well realised creature from the first. Now obviously that was a higher budget movie, and that came from Stan Winston, so it's understandable why. But it's, you know, it is what it is. It just doesn't look as good. It's also at times too overlit, that kind of shows these flaws. The cinematography was quite dark to a degree, and I think that gave them a mystique to the creature, and also kind of hid some of the flaws. Not so much in this one. So the creature doesn't really look as good, to be honest. It's still a similar design, but doesn't quite look as you know, as iconic, so to speak, as the first. Also, I've got to say, I think the acting in this movie is mixed, to say the least. Andrew Robinson does a good job, a handful of others. But in large part, I think some of the acting here is on the poorer side. You know, there's a lot of actors here who didn't really go on to do, you know, anything too sort of high profile. And there's probably a reason for that. There's a couple of, I mean, you've got one of the actors here from Return of the Living Dead Part 3, who's the male lead in that. Here he's kind of like the main teenage antagonist to a degree. But, you know, it's not brilliant acting by large part. And also the dialogue, I've got to say, is, you know, somewhat hokey at times, it must be said. And the way these characters are kind of depicted, I think it's like using a sledgehammer to do some of this characterization. What do I mean by that? Let me give you a little bit more context. I mean, it's just like, so we set up at the beginning in this scene in the 50s where we have this deformed boy called Tommy, an orphan living in the woods, being looked after by this old woman. And then we have these 6 teenage boys who, for seemingly no real reason, go out there, torture him, and then murder him. And it's so cruel. You're thinking, how would 6 individuals clearly plan to do this and then laugh about it and have absolutely no qualms about it? And it's like, it's so like over the top evil, you know. The original had them, the inciting death be an accident, and I guess there is murders, but it just seemed like, you know, what was the context of that? I mean, it just seemed like, okay, we'll sledgehammer this point down. And yes, they're despicable people, but it just seemed to me, it was so cruel. To me, it needed a little bit more context. And then just as we go on, the characters just seem so overbaked like that. Our modern group of teenagers, you know, when they kind of confront this older woman, there's the one guy who's maybe a little bit more responsible than the rest because he sort of hits the older woman. But again, it's just like, I feel it's a little bit too over the top at times with the kind of like the sort of characterizations and the kind of the actions that these kind of people are taking. And then we sort of have this situation, spoiler here if you haven't seen this, but it's an old film, where at the end of the movie, like the Andrew Robinson's character is kind of pleading with the Pumpkinhead creature to spare his daughter, who is one of the people who have got mixed up in this kind of gang of modern teenagers, and the Pumpkinhead creature does spare the daughter, but she's no less responsible than the kind of the bulk of these teenagers. I mean, the kind of the leader had definitely had more culpability, but the rest of them were just as responsible as this daughter. Well, they died, but she didn't, and it's kind of why, because she's the daughter of the main character. That's why. All right. So it's a little bit, the characterization here was just a little bit sort of broad, if that makes sense. It somewhat kind of contradicts the sort of rules set up by the original movie. I guess you could say it sort of expands the lore on one hand, but it also seems to not follow what was set before. Now, arguably, you might say there's different Pumpkinhead creatures and they don't all follow the same rules, so I guess you could have explained it by that, but it sort of doesn't really stick to the, as I say, what was set up sort of before. It definitely doesn't have that sort of air of gothic ambience that the original definitely did. And again, it's probably down to the budget more than anything else. It definitely feels like a somewhat Sci-Fi Channel-esque kind of creature on the loose movie. It's still somewhat enjoyable, but it's kind of a brainless movie, to be honest. You know, it's a certain degree of fun, but it's probably somewhat lacking in certain areas, and as such, I'll give this one a slightly below average score of 4. Have you seen it? What did you think? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.